is very often that the dentist has much more frequent interaction with individuals than an actual physician, because people will always go in, at least certainly here in the US, going in for a cleaning and a dental checkup, they will do far more readily and far more frequently than they will to a visit to their physician. And so the dentist really is the front lines, and they can start to detect problems if they know what to look for, including metabolically, than their physician ever would. So now back to type 2 diabetes. Part of the reason this problem is taking over the world and why we are detecting it so late and we're treating it so poorly is that we look at it the wrong way. Conventional medicine looks at type 2 diabetes through the lens of glucose. So they see only the glucose, and they're only ever tracking the glucose. So the patient is coming in ideally for their annual visit, but often it's every 2 or 3 years. They come in for their annual visit and they're looking at the glucose. And that's one of the key markers that they will only look at. And behind the scenes, there's this other character just sort of screaming for attention, and that's insulin. What we will do with the higher glucose, we will say, let's just push your insulin up even higher, because insulin doesn't matter. They have no regard for it. And in so doing, they will push the glucose down. But as just proof positive that this isn't a glucose disease, you can give the person extra insulin and give them more medications to push their insulin up higher and higher and push the glucose down lower and lower subsequently, but we kill them faster when we do that. The more aggressively we're trying to lower glucose in a type 2 diabetic by pushing the insulin up, we make them 3 times more likely to die from heart disease and twice as likely to die from cancer and to get Alzheimer's disease. So we are literally making the patient fatter and sicker by aggressively treating the glucose while ignoring the insulin. Insulin literally affects every cell of the body. At only some of the cells does it actually control the uptake of glucose, like the muscle cells, some of the cells in the brain, in the hippocampus, and a few in the fat cells. But for the most part, most of the cells of the body don't need insulin to tell it to take in glucose. They can take in glucose freely. Even still, those cells do respond to insulin in some way. Insulin will tell every cell to do something. And the theme, if there's any, the theme of insulin at every cell of the body is to tell the cell to take in nutrients and to store them. It essentially tells the cell what to do with the energy that it has. It won't necessarily push it to take in glucose, but even still, it will tell the cell what to do with the energy that it has. And so when you look across all the cells of the body, and we look at this in the context of insulin resistance, we need to remember that insulin resistance is really a problem, a coin with 2 sides. One side is that insulin isn't working as well as it used to at some of the cells of the body. That's the insulin resistance part of what we call insulin resistance, like what's happening at the muscle. Insulin's trying to tell the muscle to take in glucose, but the muscle isn't responding as well as it used to, so glucose levels start to climb. Other cells of the body, again, respond perfectly well, and that is a problem in light of the other side of the coin, which is that blood levels of insulin are chronically elevated, a condition called hyperinsulinemia. Those two always come together. Anytime someone's invoking the term insulin resistance, whether it's in disease or whether it's serving a good purpose like it does in pregnancy, regardless, those two things are always happening in concert. You cannot have one without the other. So normally when insulin comes to the liver, it does all kinds of things, but it wants to tell the liver to store glucose as glycogen. So all the glucose that's coming into the liver, it wants it to lock it up. And it also wants the liver to turn any excess glucose into fat, so activating a process called lipogenesis. And this can be stored in the liver a little bit, and some of it can be emitted from the liver in VLDL and LDL, so the liver's way of moving fat around the body. So when the liver becomes insulin resistant, the insulin is still promoting lipogenesis. That biochemical pathway is not compromised. It is not insulin resistant. However, the glycogenesis, or the stimulation of the liver to take in and store glucose, is compromised. And so normally insulin would be telling the liver to store glucose, but that isn't working anymore. And now, even though insulin is high, the liver starts releasing glucose when it's supposed to be storing it. Now, this ends up really feeding into a big problem, because if you already have high glucose, and the liver would be a place where insulin's trying to tuck the glucose away, but it's starting to release more glucose, which is trying to then would result in more insulin, which feeds more insulin resistance, which just starts to perpetuate the problem. The idea of oral inflammation from like a gum infection, gingivitis or periodontitis, where that is then contributing a genuine inflammatory load throughout the rest of the body. In fact, we published a paper from my lab, in multiple papers at this point, where we detailed lipopolysaccharide, a common pro-inflammatory molecule, like a remnant from bacteria, that comes from a common gum or oral infection, P. gingivalis. And we documented where this pro-inflammatory molecule from oral infections is very pro-inflammatory throughout the body and explicitly activates a process within the cells that creates insulin resistance. The process is fascinating. It's kind of detailed, so I won't get into it, but we've published papers on this where LPS is directly stimulating insulin resistance. So I certainly present a fat-first perspective, that insulin resistance starts in the fat cells. But you mentioned one that is also very, very relevant, where it could, in fact, start from the mouth, is that when they actually mine plaques out of coronary arteries, and they will scoop out some of that plaque, they will detect dozens of infectious pathogens, dozens of infectious bacteria, including oral bacteria, which is why, very likely why, people with frequent gum infections are significantly more likely to have heart disease. It's because part of the development of an atherosclerotic plaque could very well simply be an infection that has moved from the mouth into the blood vessels, and perhaps arteriosclerosis is nothing more than inflammation from an infection. Now, putting that aside, insulin resistance is fantastically relevant to heart disease. It induces the constriction of blood vessels. It induces sodium retention at the kidneys, so the person has water retention, and that means higher blood pressure. It activates the sympathetic nervous system to further induce vasoconstriction, or the narrowing of blood vessels, and to increase the pressure of the heart, or the contractility of the heart, so the heart is beating harder and faster. So all of this is, of course, contributing to hypertension, which is one of the main drivers of heart disease. And then lastly, insulin resistance contributes to dyslipidemia. And I won't say anything about LDL, because I think LDL gets too much credit in this process, but it lowers HDL cholesterol directly, insulin resistance does, and it increases triglycerides, which in the high triglyceride to HDL ratio is very, very predictive of heart disease. But Stephen, one comment about LDL, and it's very relevant when we talk about LPS. LPS is that little pro-inflammatory bacterial remnant that can move in from an oral infection, as well as from the intestines, if the intestinal wall is leaky. LDL is one of the unsung heroes of the immune system, where it will physically bind to LPS. And in so doing, it will neutralize LPS and then carry it to the liver to be excreted into the intestines and then removed from the body through the bile duct. So LDL, far from just being a villain, it really might be trying to correct the problem by scavenging the LPS and preventing it from activating inflammatory pathways in the blood vessels. So, this is so relevant, and anyone who says otherwise is honestly either uninformed or they're deliberately misleading. So, in Australia, well, I know you have a broader audience than that. So, just like in Australia, as it is in the United States, the most common form of infertility in women is polycystic ovary syndrome. I say PCOS. I know in Australia they'll sometimes say PCOS, but just PCOS is this problem where the obvious problem is that the ovaries are accumulating cysts. And all of these cysts actually were little eggs that are there because the woman fails to ovulate during her ovulatory cycle. And ovulation requires, to bring in the sex hormones, ovulation requires an enormous spike of estrogens. The estrogens are the hormone that will precede and ultimately kind of contribute to just pushing the ovaries to actually have one of these kind of developing eggs, one of these developing follicles, to actually bud off of the ovary, and which is actually the act of ovulation. In so doing, all of the other little follicles that we're developing will degrade and just kind of work back into the ovary and turn into nothing. But you have to have an estrogen spike in order to ovulate. Remarkably, insulin has an inhibitory effect on the ovary's ability to create estrogens. It's a little known fact that all estrogens in men and women were once testosterone. So the ovaries and the testes, so all gonads to varying degrees, will take some of the testosterone and convert it into estrogens. And it does this through an enzyme called aromatase. Now, insulin steps in and it inhibits aromatase. And it's always doing it a little bit, but of course, as insulin is going higher and higher, now it's pushing aromatase down further and further. And so the ovaries are trying to convert all of this testosterone into estrogens, and now it can't. And so two things happen. The woman fails to have sufficient estrogen release to ovulate, so she develops the polycystic ovaries. And two, she now has an abundance of testosterone, which is having other undesirable effects, like maybe development of body hair, male pattern baldness, acne, and similar consequences. And again, those are undesirable. They're not directly necessarily contributing to the infertility, but all of it is in some way derivative of the high insulin. And then, Stephen, less relevant to sex hormones though, but relevant to fertility, is what happens in the man and how his insulin resistance is affecting his blood vessels. And that's why insulin resistance is the leading cause of erectile dysfunction. It's not because it's damaging his testosterone or anything like that. It's hurting his blood vessels. And you can't have an erection without substantial dilation of the blood vessels. And insulin resistance stops that from happening. High insulin and insulin resistance is a way for the body to assess the fitness of the environment and the fitness of the individual in a way. And it's essentially a marker, a canary in the coal mine that's whistling back to the person saying, hey, you are not okay. Your metabolic house is not in order. Don't get pregnant right now until we get these things worked out. Because really, the fact that you see the two most common infertilities, PCOS in women, erectile dysfunction in men, that insulin resistance is the single most common driver of these, I think, to me, and this is, of course, speculation. This is the philosophy now. I think it's because it's the body's way of saying, we're not okay. We need to get this stuff worked out first. You got it worked out? Okay, now we're good to go. And sure enough, that's almost always what happens. As a person improves their insulin resistance and becomes more insulin sensitive and insulin levels come down, she now has a normal ovulatory cycle and can get pregnant. He now has normal vasodilation and can have a normal erection. And this is usually in people with a a family history of type 2 diabetes. So if a woman's getting pregnant and mom or dad had type 2 diabetes, she has to be much more concerned about making sure her insulin resistance doesn't go too far. She's going to have some, there's no avoiding it, and there's no reason to avoid it. She needs to become somewhat insulin resistant during the pregnancy. But this would be a person who'd need to be a little more careful. But the overall paradigm is just the same as with type 2 diabetes. Her insulin levels are going up ever higher. It's serving a purpose, helping her and the baby grow. But then eventually, if she allows the insulin resistance to get very bad, or she just has a genetic predisposition and so she has to fight even harder, she becomes very resistant to her own insulin, and now her glucose levels start to climb. And with the rising glucose, this goes from just the normal insulin resistance of pregnancy to gestational diabetes. And the consequences are real. If a woman has gestational diabetes, she is significantly more likely to develop type 2 diabetes later. And her baby is much more likely to develop type 2 diabetes later in life. And the reasons for that are unknown, but I will speculate again. It's almost like when the mom has gestational diabetes, the baby is literally developing in an environment of high glucose and high insulin. And so it's possible that the little boy or the little girl essentially becomes hardwired to seek high glucose and high insulin even after the baby's born. And so it might drive the baby to just want to eat a way that's going to keep the glucose and insulin at a level that he or she literally developed in utero. One is in chronically elevated insulin itself, making the body resistant to the insulin. 2 was inflammation, and then 3 is stress. And I define these as primary causes because in the biomedical realm, all of what's been published, you can cause insulin resistance with those 3 stimuli in isolated cells, in laboratory rodents, and in humans. We have proof of these, the relevance of these in all of these biomedical models. So with stress, you mentioned the stress hormone cortisol, and I would add epinephrine, or adrenaline, the same thing. So that is where the rubber meets the road. So when we say that stress can cause insulin resistance, what we're saying is that the prototypical stress hormones, cortisol and epinephrine, are causing the body to become insulin resistant. And they do so quite directly. Those are part of a family of hormones called, one way of defining them is insulin antagonists. So cortisol and epinephrine, among their many, many effects, what they have in common, almost the only thing they have in common, is that they want to push glucose up all the time. They want to, especially cortisol. Cortisol will literally strip protein from the muscles and bones in order to turn it into glucose in the liver. So they want to push glucose up. Well, that of course puts them at odds with insulin, who's trying to bring the glucose down. And so we end up having a war between the stress hormones and insulin. In the process, overall, one of the consequences is that the body's becoming insulin resistant. And this is a phenomenon that can happen very, very quickly. And we see it clinically if someone is given a steroid, a cortisol-like steroid to control inflammation. It will inhibit the inflammation, but they will become very, very insulin resistant very quickly. It settles in, or the onset is very rapid, and I actually think the reversal is very rapid as well. We do see this in acute settings of sleep deprivation. So sleep deprivation or insomnia will cause insulin resistance, and it does so by increasing the stress hormones. But one good night of sleep undoes several bad nights of sleep when it comes to insulin sensitivity. So I think when it comes to stress-induced insulin resistance, we can have an optimistic view, which is really based on the idea that just as it can be a very rapid onset, it can also be a very rapid reversal. This is a new area for my lab. We've published a very high-impact paper earlier this year on this very topic. So the hippocampus is the part of the brain that is involved with how we typically define cognition, like memory and learning and understanding. The hippocampus, like most sections of the brain, relies on 2 fuels, glucose and ketones. Glucose appears to be what's problematic. So my study found that when these were actually human brain samples, human hippocampal slices from tissue donors, and people that had Alzheimer's disease had a reduction in glucose-related genes or glucose metabolism-related genes. All the genes involved in the metabolism of glucose were all down. Every single gene had much lower expression in the hippocampus of people who died with Alzheimer's compared with the people who didn't. In contrast, the genes involved in ketone metabolism were almost totally normal within the entire hippocampus. There were a couple genes that were down, but otherwise were all up, the same in both in both brains. This is important because it also acts almost foundational to other research that has actually quantified in living, breathing humans that the brain takes in and metabolizes less glucose in states of early cognitive decline or outright Alzheimer's disease, but it can still take in and metabolize ketones without any deficit. We're looking at the degree to which the hippocampus becomes insulin resistant. Now, I'd mentioned earlier that not all tissues need insulin for glucose uptake. Well, the hippocampus is one of those that do. At least some of the glucose uptake that comes into the hippocampus is through insulin-dependent mechanisms. So if the hippocampus is becoming insulin resistant, now it's unable to get as much of its energy from glucose. And that matters so much because the brain is an energy hog. It has an enormous energy demand, among the highest metabolic rates of any organs in the body. And so if the metabolic demands of the brain is up here, And glucose, which is the common fuel, just because most people are eating glucose all the time and they have never any ketones because their insulin's always elevated. So they have this much energy demand. Glucose is providing that much energy demand. As the hippocampus is becoming insulin resistant, now glucose can't meet all the energetic needs, and we're left with an energy gap. Now, again, the tragedy is that the body is swimming in a sea of glucose, but insulin isn't working well enough to get the glucose in. And adding insult to injury, the person is eating starchy and sugary carbohydrates so frequently that they never have any ketones in their blood, which would enable the brain to make up that energetic gap. So the view in my lab and others is that Alzheimer's disease, to some degree, and I'm not claiming that it would be all of it, but to some degree the cognitive impairment is a result of insulin resistance of the hippocampus. And so if we can improve the insulin resistance of the hippocampus, we can perhaps help the hippocampus make up that energy gap, get back to full energy, and then get back to full function. Somewhere, others are saying that saturated fat is the cause of insulin resistance. They're saying this with an ounce of truth. But then they're lost. There's an ounce of truth and a pound of error in the way they're interpreting these kinds of things. So the truth is that if you take muscle cells and incubate these muscle cells with high levels of saturated fat, they will become insulin resistant. So in that sense, we've shown, I've in fact done these studies and published these studies. Saturated fat directly on cells will cause the cells to become insulin resistant. But that's not what happens when a person eats saturated fat. We have multiple clinical studies to show that if someone's on a low carbohydrate diet, they may be eating 3 or 4 times more saturated fat, and yet they're becoming more insulin sensitive than the other group. And moreover, when we look at a population scale over the past 40 years or so, the consumption of saturated fats has been plummeting. Well, then how can we correlate that? How can we reconcile that with the fact that diabetes is skyrocketing? It doesn't fit. We're eating less saturated fat than we have in a generation or two, and yet diabetes is a scourge. It's running rampant. So we have that ounce of truth that if you incubate cells with saturated fat, they will become insulin resistant, but that doesn't jive with what happens physiologically, because when you eat a fat, it's getting moved through the body, it's getting desaturated, it's getting extended. The body's doing all kinds of different things with these fats. It's not just as simple as a cell being loaded with saturated fat. Now, similarly though, Stephen, there's an experimental error that people will interpret, which is when you infuse fat. If you infuse fat into a human or in a rodent, it doesn't matter what the fat is, whether it's polyunsaturated, beloved among vegans, or monounsaturated, also beloved, or the dreaded saturated fat, which comes from fruit sources and animal sources, even more from fruit sources, but that's an inconvenient truth. Saturated fat, it doesn't matter what the fat is. If you are infusing it directly into the bloodstream, the body will become insulin resistant simply because you're forcing it to metabolize this enormous bolus of fat that you just infused the blood with. And so the body is thinking, I am loaded with fat right now. I'm going to stop metabolizing the glucose for a moment, and so I'm going to become insulin resistant to stop my glucose use. And instead, I'm going to shift over to only burning all of this fat, which was just literally infused directly into my blood vessels. That is an artificial model. It is not the same as eating fat.